Hello all, how are you doing? Good, and welcome to my retrospective of Dark Souls 3. Before I get stuck in, massive thanks to everyone who checked out my video on Dark Souls 1. The response to it was awesome and I was just flattered as hell by all the nice comments people left. Now the keen-eyed among you may notice that I've skipped a game here and went straight to Dark Souls 3 instead of covering the second game, and the simple reason for that is that I just don't have Dark Souls 2 on Steam. When it goes on sale though, I'll do a video on it then. Whereas I had my rocky beginnings with the first Dark Souls, like many of its first time players, it eventually grew to be one of my favourite and most played games, leaving me desperate for more. Of course we'd get Dark Souls 2, 2.5 years later. However, as we know, that game attracted quite a bit of sour opinions, ranging from folk who consider it to be the weakest entry in the series, to folk who think it's literally the worst game ever made. But personally, I freaking love Dark Souls 2. After it, there'd be a brief break in the Dark Souls series to make way for the masterpiece that was Bloodborne, bringing in a faster, more frantic feel and flavour that would persist for every subsequent Soulsborne title. And then just 1 year after Bloodborne, Dark Souls would return in splendid fashion with the third and final title in the trilogy. By the way, I didn't realise that there was a Soulsborne game released every year for 3 years between 2014 and 2016. Wild. Anyway, when the first trailers for Dark Souls 3 came out, it was immediately obvious that the Souls formula had been intensified somewhat, with the gameplay appearing more fast-paced than the first two games in the series. Some lamented this change, preferring the relatively slower pace of combat found in the earlier games, while others appreciated the more energetic feel of FromSoft's newer titles. Personally, my opinion was, I don't care, it's Dark Souls, it's going to be sick, put it inside me. I took the whole week off work for Dark Souls 3 coming out, and I remember the day of its release well, because on that day I got a random text from my letting agent telling me that the landlord had decided to sell the flat I was living in and that I'd have to move out. This had came out of nowhere, so I phoned her to ask what was going on, but turned out that she'd just sent the text to the wrong person, because she had another client with the exact same name as me. Anyway, what does this have to do with Dark Souls 3, you might be wondering? And the answer is literally nothing. I played the game near non-stop every day that week before finishing it on the Friday, having clocked in around 40 hours of playtime. And when I did finish it, I distinctly remember thinking that it might be the best game I'd ever played. Now I will say that I love Dark Souls 3, but I don't think quite so strongly about it now, and I think what probably caused me to have been moved by it to that extent was how intensely dark and depressing the game is. Of course, the previous games have been dark too, but Dark Souls 3 took it to a new level, and with it being the last game in the series, the content felt appropriately apocalyptic and cold, and this tone was only intensified further with its two outstanding DLCs. Since its release back in 2016, I've probably finished Dark Souls 3 a good 8 to 10 times, and although it wasn't as groundbreaking or innovative as the first game in the series, it is a damn sick game nonetheless. And so, with that introduction done, I think it's about damn time we get cracking with the video. Quick word on the structure of the video first before I go balls deep into Dark Souls 3. I'll provide an intro to the world and setup of the game first, and then follow the Unkindled One's journey from level to level, explaining relevant mechanics and gameplay elements along the way. Same as with my video of Dark Souls 1, I won't be diving too deep into the lore with this one, but I will discuss the nature of the game's story from time to time. Whereas Dark Souls 1 was set in Lordran and Dark Souls 2 was set in Drangleic, the third and final entry in the trilogy takes place in Lothric, where all other lands of the world are now quite literally converging, with land masses, megastructures and assorted architecture now shifting from different corners of the world, crunching and grinding closer and closer into a single point. Although both civilization and sanity were driven to the brink in the first two Dark Souls games, there were still elements of hope there. In Dark Souls 1, the hope revolved around becoming the second Lord of Cinder, linking one's soul to the first flame and allowing the Age of Fire to continue. Well, in Dark Souls 3, God knows how many ages have passed since the time of Gwyn, and Lord knows how many times the first flame has been linked and relinked again and again, with the flame gradually weakening each time. The first flame is hope, and hope is fading. At Firelink Shrine, the bell tolls, signalling that the flame is in imminent danger of fading, but this bell also heralds the revival of 4 former Lords of Cinder from their graves, so that they may return to their thrones to once again serve as kindling for the first flame, extending the Age of Fire once more, perhaps far past its nature. However, the Lords do not return to their thrones. Rather, they choose to return to their own lands, previously remote and distant to Lothric, now close by due to the ongoing convergence. Thus, because of this abandonment, a new type of undead known as the Unkindled rise up out of their graves, with their goal being to return the 4 Lords of Cinder to their moulding thrones to be used as kindling for the linking of the fire. And that's the story setup for the player's entire journey throughout the lands of Lothric. The player must journey through the game world and defeat each Lord of Cinder. It's kind of a classic trope at this point, with the 4 powerful enemies in the world to be defeated, and indeed the same thing was done in Dark Souls 1 with the 4 Lords, and in Dark Souls 2 with the 4 Old Ones. Also, folk who have played Elden Ring recently might have noticed that the concept of the Unkindled is remarkably similar to the Tarnished, to the point where it's almost identical. Like in nearly every Soulsborne game, we start off by creating our character and picking a class. I went with a Dex build for my Dark Souls 1 playthrough and didn't touch ranged offense at all, and so for this playthrough I changed it up a bit and went with a Pyromancer build, because who doesn't like chucking a fireball every now and then, and missing. Stats have changed a wee bit since the days of the first game also. There's now a luck stat, which determines item discovery, and also endurance now only affects how much stamina points you have, with vitality determining max equip load, as opposed to endurance doing both of these things and being a bit too valuable of a stat compared to the others. And so, we wake up in the Cemetery of Ash, quite literally rising up out of a grave, giving us the chance to stretch our legs and get a feel for the controls and combat. As I mentioned earlier, things feel pretty damn different in this game compared to the previous 2. Everything is way faster now, from the general movement to the rolling to the healing to the combat. Having just finished a Dark Souls 1 playthrough a week or so ago, I played like absolute shit for the first large chunk of this game before I eventually got the feel for it. Funnily enough, for me, going from Elden Ring to Dark Souls 1 didn't really feel all that jarring, because those 2 games feel so different, and so the absence of a jump button didn't really bother me. With Dark Souls 3 however, this game looks and feels very similar to Elden Ring, and so I really did lament the lack of a jump, though this feeling did only last about an hour before I adjusted. The Cemetery of Ash is a great starting area, and there are plenty of huddled, hooded hollows sitting and standing around for you to practice burning, slashing, parrying, blocking and tanking, which is absolutely a skill. There's a wee turn off before the main path that the player can take, where you can find a big weird crystal thing looming in the distance, serving as a nice wee optional challenge if the player is up to it. This thing will most likely flatten any first time player, though they're not actually all that tough once you learn their erratic attacks, and it serves as a tantalising optional challenge for any Souls veteran. Or you can skip the wizard and just go straight for the first bonfire, and as if it needed saying at this point, bonfires act as checkpoints whenever you die. Although again, due to me being very experienced with Dark Souls 3, I can't have died more than say 4 or 5 times this whole playthrough. Alright, so going forward from here.
Leave us be.
I trust you've learned your lesson.
Although there's nowhere else to teleport to just yet, Dark Souls 3 actually lets you walk to any previously visited bonfire right away. There's no Lord Vessel to find first here. Of course, this trend continued in Sekiro, and even more so in Elden Ring, where you can fast travel anywhere nearly whenever you want. And I don't see FromSoft going back to a more restricted fast travel system anytime soon in any future Soulsborne games, but hey, who knows. One criticism I have heard with this game is the proximity of some different bonfires to each other. For example, from the Grand Archives bonfire, you can literally see the Dragon Slayer armor bonfire just a 10-second run away. The reason for this is simply that a bonfire spawns whenever you beat any boss in this game, and so there ends up being some rather odd bonfire placements, but really, who cares? It's hardly a game ruiner, is it? From here it's just a hop, a slash and a death to the very first boss in the game, and it can be a pretty damn tough one. Very cool, threatening dude in armour, of course over twice the size of the player, but then halfway through he turns into a damn black hole or something and goes crazy. Honestly, for as many times as I've beaten this game, I still find it really difficult to understand these attacks, because it's difficult to tell the difference between the startup animations and the actual attack animations. I died. Luckily this dude is weak against fire, so pyromancy or fireballs work wonders. I do like Gundyr as a boss, but I'm not sure I love him as a first boss, because I can easily see a first time Souls player having an absolute nightmare here. After beating him, we can travel further ahead and then enter the hub area of Dark Souls 3, Firelink Shrine. Wee bit confusing when you first come here because it looks nothing like the Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls 1, but yeah, this is a different Firelink Shrine, I think. Like every Soulsborne hub area, more NPCs will gradually gather here as you discover them throughout the lands of Lothric, and they'll each have their own role and purpose, serving as vendors, pyromancers, sorcerers, whiners, and Hunchback Rock dude. Andre of Astora is also back again, somehow, looking identical to how he did in Dark Souls 1, with the same distinctive voice actor and everything, though I am a bit sick of hearing the words,
Pretty be careful. I don't want to see my work squandered.
This hub area is more than decent and looks very cool with the 5 thrones elevated over the central bonfire, where the Lord Cinders must eventually be placed. However, I wasn't terribly taken by the Fire Keeper. See, in order to level up in Dark Souls 3, you've got to walk back to Firelink each time and speak to this lady, just like with the Maiden in Black in Demon Souls, the Emerald Herald in Dark Souls 2, and the Doll in Bloodborne, except the Fire Keeper in Dark Souls 3 just isn't quite as memorable. She's fine, and to be honest, there are actually some fairly effective emotional tones with this character, which come into play further in the game, but she's just not one of my favourite level up ladies. From Firelink, after placing the coiled sword into the flame, we can finally begin our journey and warp to Lothric proper. Although we had a fair bit of combat and even a boss to start off with at the cemetery, the high wall of Lothric is where the game properly begins, and it doesn't waste much time delivering some decent challenge. This place is hard. A ton of enemy types are thrown at you throughout this level, like dogs, thief hollows, the axe and halberd hollows, the pus of man enemies, a dragon, the winged knight, Lothric knights and a bunch more, and so this is probably where the player is going to want to very quickly step up their game combat wise. Before I continue on with gameplay though, I can't say another word about it before I highlight how insanely beautiful Dark Souls 3 is. It's literally one of the best looking games I've ever seen, not just in terms of raw graphics, but largely due to the stark, dead, apocalyptic scenes and style. In almost every area, you are immersed in and surrounded by death and decay. Even the things still living mostly look half dead, and whereas Dark Souls 1's Undead Burg flaunts a bright red drake at you in one of its early areas, Dark Souls 3 is littered with dead dragons, although admittedly there are still living ones too, although even those are only being animated by perversions of the abyss. See, I love dark and depressing media, be it music, movies or games, because I find that artistic expressions of negative emotion tend to be far more powerful and often beautiful than expressions of joy or happiness. It's why my favourite music tends to be the more extreme genres of metal, and why my all-time favourite movie is Nil by Mouth. Watch Nil by Mouth. It was directed over 25 years ago by Gary Oldman, and it's perfect, but also you might hate it. My point with all this is that the aesthetic of Dark Souls 3 carries an intense emotional weight to it, even if you aren't really following the story, something which is probably true of the majority of players. I mean, look at this scene of the emaciated, non-hostile Hollow staring long and late at the swollen sun. It's powerful stuff, especially due to how nightmarish and grim everything here is. In this very area, just a minute previously, we're being vomited on and infested with giant leeches from disgusting corpse creatures, and yet it still all carries a powerful, distinctive beauty. I don't know if I've ever played another game that so effectively manages to imbue disgust and decay with such emotion, like this cadaverous pregnant dog and its partner hiding below along a hidden path, ferociously attacking and spewing on the player in frenzied dying desperation, or the mighty titanic giants of the Cathedral of the Deep, hunched over and dejected in a foul mire of sludge, or the old demon king surrounded by countless scores of his deceased demon kin, who literally gives up the fight and lets you finish him off, or the stray demon aimlessly wandering atop a broken bridge, now literally crumbling away. As terrible and beautiful and horrific and magnificent as the world of Lothric is though, the DLC turns it up even higher still, particularly the Rhine City DLC, which just left me feeling cold and dead inside at the end. I love it. Compared to Dark Souls 1, combat in Dark Souls 3 is significantly more hectic. Whereas the first game certainly had sections where you could expect to get flooded with fast enemies and beaten off and pounded against the wall, combat in that game did often have a distinctly methodical feel to it. There was usually the feeling that you could take your time and wait for an opening and then run in and strike, rather than all-out aggression being the answer. While in Dark Souls 3, retreating back and calmly waiting for an opening tends not to work so well, although there certainly are exceptions. While the player's movements are much faster, the same is true of all enemies, and their ability to gain ground and catch up to you and attack as you're desperately trying to roll away has been massively enhanced. It's kind of funny, because it's like a lot of attacks are specifically designed to make you panic and frantically mash the roll button, but then at the same time, the attacks are also designed to punish this exact response by propelling enemies forward as they leap, dash and flurry at the player. Rolling feels faster now, and importantly, it also consumes less stamina to perform a roll, meaning that the player has a greater capacity to squeeze in as many as possible before their stamina bar fully depletes. Stamina management is absolutely still a thing here though, and although 2019's Sekiro would scrap the stamina bar altogether, we certainly weren't there yet with Dark Souls 3. It's pretty obvious very early on that Bloodborne DNA was very much brought over to this game. Not entirely of course, because it's not quite as fast paced as Bloodborne, but still it gets pretty damn close sometimes, and there are some enemies and bosses that skirt that line remarkably closely, like Frida and the Corvid enemies from the Ashes of Ariandel DLC. I got hit so many times throughout this playthrough. In fact, I think I got hit in nearly every combat encounter, because I suck. However, while I do think this is the most frantic Souls game and the easiest one to take hits in, I also found that getting hit once or twice tended not to be as consequential. Usually when I died in combat encounters, it wasn't because I'd taken a couple of big hits, it was because I'd taken a whole bunch of small to medium hits in quick succession due to the faster, more ferocious nature of enemy movesets. Although movesets aside for a minute, the player's downfall will often come about as a result of the sheer volume of enemies. Dark Souls 3 throws so many goddamn enemies at you sometimes, and you will panic. Often it's actually a little bit deceptive though, with some enemies being semi-unaware, not much of a threat, easy to barge past, or semi-hostile. However, when you do have an army of undead hot on your tail, things can get really difficult to manage, and moments like these make me very glad that there are invincibility frames when opening doors and such. What I will say about combat difficulty in Dark Souls 3 is that I did find myself getting rather salty on more than a few occasions throughout this playthrough. I think the sheer number of enemies in some locations somewhat exacerbated this, because the feeling of meticulously clearing out a whole level full of monsters and then getting destroyed by some group of weaker enemies with never-ending combos can be quite aggravating. Also, around about halfway through the game, enemies and bosses will actually start doing some really serious damage to you, and I hate seeing half my health bar just disappear from a regular attack off some late game monster. It's annoying and can turn me into a pissy bitch. A piss bitch. Dark Souls 3 is when FromSoft started really implementing delayed attacks too. Of course, Elden Ring is really notorious for having intentionally confusing attack wind-ups designed to make you panic roll and then get hit just as you run out of iframes. But make no mistake, they'd started to dabble with it a bit in this game too, and it's no less infuriating. Of course, it just means that you need to learn attack patterns, but the first time you get tricked can be a real pisser. Anyway, back in the high wall of Lothric, that level I was supposed to be talking about 10 minutes ago. I absolutely love this place, and I'm a sucker for a good castle type area with big knights and cool armour. Don't get me wrong, I can appreciate a good Catacombs or Cathedral, but this place is just so sick. The central Lothric level is very interesting in that it's both an early game and late game area. The boss you're expected to fight here is Vort, who'll then lead on to the next area. However, if you're feeling particularly daring, you can slaughter this old lady to trigger a very challenging late game boss, which you almost certainly won't be able to beat yet. Fun fact, I've actually finished Dark Souls 3 with a level 1 character before, and Dancer of the Boreal Valley was one of 3 bosses which were a goddamn nightmare for me to beat, to the point that I'll never do that challenge again, because it's hard. After the high wall, the player is spirited off to the Undead Settlement in a scene clearly meant to evoke fond memories of Dark Souls 1. They do the exact same thing again too later on in the Ring City DLC. It's all good though. To be honest, I don't quite know what I think about the Undead Settlement. I feel like I should really like it, but I don't. But then, nor do I dislike it. It's really big, challenging, has multiple different paths to take through the level, one of the coolest bosses in the game, and one of the coolest damn sections in the game where both the player and the undead villagers are violently obliterated by 10-foot long arrows being fired off by a troll in a tower armed with a colossal greatbow. By the way, something I never noticed on any previous playthrough is that you can clearly see the troll firing off arrows from his high tower right at the first bonfire. Awesome detail there. If you locate and ascend this tower, you can befriend the troll after a frankly baffling exchange.
I help anytime.
And now, he'll provide you with covering fire with his arrows, not only at this area, but also outside the Cathedral of the Deep area, as well as a certain location at Farron Keep. There was one NPC in particular I had business with in the Undead Settlement, and that was Cornyx the Pyromancer, who's caged up but who'll walk back to Firelink Shrine after a brief chat. This sort of thing happens with several NPCs who you meet out in the game world. You'll find them in a state of hopelessness, loneliness or boredom, and then when your player character interacts with them, they perk up and agree to help you out. But the way that Cornyx just teleports out of the cage, even though we didn't even free him, implies that these characters could have left any time they wanted to, except they had no reason to leave or do much of anything. Again, it goes back to that whole sad, depressing element I expounded upon earlier. There's an optional boss in the Undead Settlement, but it's too important to not fight, not to mention too much of a damn spectacle. The thing is massive and has some insane attacks. There's this one attack it does in phase 2 where it stands up tall to its full height and then drops down, and it's one of the coolest attacks I've ever seen, but unfortunately I didn't manage to get footage of it here. Beating the Greatwood gets us a very important item called the Transposing Kiln, and giving this to Ludleth Corland in Firelink Shrine allows the player to transpose boss souls into their corresponding boss weapon, ability or ring. I really like how they made this easier to do in Dark Souls 2 and 3, because creating boss weapons was always a bit of a pain in the arse to do in Demon Souls and Dark Souls, whereas here all you need is the correct boss soul and sometimes some regular souls as payment. Some of the most extravagant and outrageous weapons are obtained this way, not to mention some of the best sorcery, miracles and pyromancy. At the end of the Undead Settlement lies the Crucifixion Woods, and around the midpoint of this level is where the game actually allows you to split off into different paths. See, for around the first, say, 6 to 8 hours of Dark Souls 3, the game is actually very linear. It goes Cemetery of Ash, Firelink Shrine, High Wall of Lothric, Undead Settlement, then Crucifixion Woods. I know there are people who consider this to be a weakness of the game, but me myself personally, I don't mind this too much, because unlike many, I don't consider linear to be a dirty word in video games. In fact, some of my favourite ever games are very linear. Nonetheless, I do get where the criticisms come from, and indeed, in addition to the linearity aspect, it certainly can't be denied. The world of Dark Souls 3 is far less interconnected compared to the previous games in the series. I mean, for a start, Firelink Shrine is totally disconnected from the main game world, and even the High Wall of Lothric is disconnected from the Undead Settlement, much like how Anor Londo was disconnected from Sense Fortress. Now that I think about it, it actually is a little bit odd that they did this, because from the Crucifixion Woods onwards, the game opens up a bunch more, and most of the rest of the game world can be traversed from here without any sort of fast travel or loading screen in between, so not sure why they made certain parts near the start so cut off. Anyway, from this point in the game, the player can either travel in the direction of the Cathedral of the Deep in search of Aldrich, one of the Lords of Cinder, or they can head through the poisonous swamps of Farron Keep to take on the Abyss Watchers, also Lords of Cinder. To be honest though, the correct option here is the first one, because there's a certain key item you need at the Cathedral before you can progress through to the rest of the game world. The Cathedral of the Deep is one of the areas I always look forward to most when starting up a fresh playthrough, not least of all because of how it manages to look both grand and disgusting at the same time. I mean, there's literally just ambiguous brown sludge everywhere for God's sake. Disgusting. The level has one of the most badass enemies in the game though, in the Cathedral Knights, but also one of the most tedious, the Thralls. What the hell is it with FromSoft and this damned enemy? Why are they everywhere in this game, and why are their imp counterparts everywhere in Elden Ring? It's not that they're really a bad enemy or anything, because they're not, it's just that I'm sick of the bloody sight of them. Just in Dark Souls 3 alone, Thralls appear in the Undead Settlement, the Grand Archives, the Cathedral of the Deep, and the Dread Heap. Why? Go away. There's a whole big bunch of shortcuts in this level, and it brings up the question of how many shortcuts are too many shortcuts, and at what point should you just put in another bloody bonfire? Speaking of the central bonfire, you'll find a very important character here, praying by the altar. His name is Gale, and he effectively serves as the portal into the Ashes of Ariandel DLC, although it's definitely advisable to leave this until a bit later, because it's kinda hard. Also, look, Gale is a great character with a tragic story, and he's also the most significant character in the DLCs. Plus, if I can very briefly bring up the ending to the Ring City DLC, Slave Knight Gale is one of the best bosses in Soulsborne history, if not the best. However, I find it difficult to not crack a grin at the fact that he carries on a full conversation from us, from this position, for over a minute. Get up, dude, this is ridiculous. But after beating the boss at the Cathedral, we do not find Aldrich, but do obtain a cute doll, which is necessary to get access to his true location. But to reach that location, we first have to pass through the expansive poison swamp of Farron Keep. Poison swamps are of course something of a trope in FromSoft games at this point. Dark Souls 3 sure as hell wasn't shy about including a few of them either, and Farron Keep is huge. Although the idea of making the player wade through a massive confusing swamp which is constantly poisoning them is at least a bit on the questionable side of the fun scale, I do still like this area. It truly is massive, there are tons of treasures and titanite to be found, and it is very intense and challenging. In no small part, due to the player's limited mobility in the sections of the swamp is deeper. The enormous tree creatures have always been an absolute nightmare for me to take down, and when I came to that part where there's a trio of them, I went no. However, due to my pyromancy build, these guys actually went down surprisingly fast this playthrough. In my Dark Souls 1 retrospective, I didn't really talk much about magic and whatnot, because I didn't use it at all for that playthrough, but it can be a really interesting and satisfying way to play the game if you choose to dabble in it, hence why I went for pyromancy for this playthrough. In Dark Souls 3, miracles, sorcery and pyromancy abilities all consume FP, with stronger abilities requiring more FP, and your FP capacity is governed by your attunement stat. Whereas Dark Souls 1 didn't really have any way to restore spell uses, and Dark Souls 2 had a plethora of consumable items to restore spell uses, FP in Dark Souls 3 can be restored by drinking from your Ashen Estus Flask, which is separate from your regular health restoring Estus Flask. The max number of Estus Flasks can be increased by finding Estus Shards out in the world, and this max number is shared between both your Ashen Flasks and regular Flasks, which is a system I love. If you're a melee focused player, you opt for more regular Estus than Ashen because you're going to be right up in the enemy's face and in more danger of losing health, whereas if you're a spellcaster, you want a higher allotment of Ashen Estus compared to regular so that you can continue to barrage knights, demons and crabs with magic, lightning and fire. It's essentially the exact same system they continue to use in Elden Ring with the flasks of Crimson Tears and Cerulean Tears. There are a ton of different ranged abilities to try out in this game, and in the same way that it's important to try out new weapons anytime you replay the game, it's often fun to try out new spells in pyromancy too. I mainly used Fire Orb and Great Combustion at the start, but then started rocking Black Flame and Black Orb later on. Although the fun really started when I got my dirty little hands on Chaos Bed vestiges after transposing the old Demon King's soul. After wading through the murky, noxious mire of Farron Keep and getting lost for 15 minutes even though I've played through the level loads of times before, we're one step closer to an encounter with the first Lord of Cinder, although in this case there's more than one of them. The Abyss Watchers are a perfect example of why Dark Souls 3 is widely considered to have many of the best bosses in the series. This fight is a frantic face-off against a small army who attack each other as much as they attack you, with a fighting style and garb reminiscent of that used by Knight Artorias from Dark Souls 1. The soundtrack for this fight is perfect, making this boss all the more epic and even sorrowful. FromSoft have shown time and again that they fully understand just what a profound effect a beautiful soundtrack can have when it comes to designing and delivering an iconic boss. Just look at the tracks for German, Gwyn and Maiden Estraya. There's a place for bombastic orchestral cacophonies with crashing choruses and irregular rhythms, but sometimes you've just got to make things sound nice. Anytime we defeat a Lord of Cinder, we receive the remains which can then be ceremoniously placed on their throne to serve as kindling at the end of the game, when all remains have been collected. After beating the Abyss Watchers, the game becomes fairly linear again, and only really gives you one viable direction to travel in, and that is the Catacombs of Carthus. Anytime I hear Catacombs in a game, it rarely fills me with much enthusiasm as I think back to the Catacombs from the first Dark Souls. Sometimes with FromSoft games, I have a hard time deciding whether an area is good or not. It might be really challenging and intricate, but if it's a massive pain in the arse to play through, is that good? Is that fun? I don't know, maybe I just suck at games. Anyway, I'm babbling like a fool. The Carthus catacombs are lousy with skeletons, and they do that obnoxious thing where they revive the first time you kill them, and then only die properly upon a second killing. Also, there are massive living balls made of bones, sick, and even bone wheels make an appearance again, although thankfully they're nowhere near as much of a ball ache as they were in the first game. The larger, more dexterous skeletons in Carthus were a freaking nightmare for me to contend with, and the times where I was caught with my trousers down by two or more of them really accentuates my points earlier about how fast and frantic combat can get in this game. Some enemies simply will not let you take a breather, and rolling away to try and get a sip or two from your Estus flask often ends up being more hazardous than simply facing the enemy head on. At the end of the Catacombs, we find the area boss, Wolnir, and I guess this would be what you'd call a gimmick boss. You can't really fight it conventionally, but what you can do is attack 3 golden bandles on its bony wrists, each of which will remove a third of its health bar. I think the term gimmick fight carries a bit of inherent stigma, but I don't mind a good gimmick boss from time to time, as long as it's fun. Unless that boss is the Dragon King or Bed of Chaos, in which case I hate it with all my heart. One nice thing about Carthus is that we get our first taste of an optional area here, with a destructible rope bridge which leads down to Smouldering Lake and the Demon Ruins. Smouldering Lake is pretty nuts because anywhere you go there's just a huge colossal crossbow firing colossal bolts directly at you from above, so I hope you're decent at timing your dodges. You can scramble around and try and collect the treasure while being fired at, but the better option is to run to the Demon Ruins first so that you can navigate to the end and deactivate the crossbow. Weird thing about the Demon Ruins is that instead of putting the area boss at the end, they put it right at the start. Not sure why, to be honest, but I will say that the Demon Ruins is my least favourite area in the game, and one that I think they probably would have been better off not including at all. It's mostly just enclosed, geometrically bland corridors which look borderline copy-pasted, and enemies you've already seen from other areas. The one unique enemy to be found here though fucking stinks. I hate fighting these things. Does this look like fun to anyone? Fuck this. Anyway, for as labyrinthine and spooky as the Catacombs of Carthus and the Demon Ruins surely are, all that blackness and bone dust is instantly washed away when we emerge out the other end into one of the most beautiful and striking areas in Dark Souls history, Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. Hot dog, now this is more like it. Irithyll is a lot of people's favourite Souls area, and with an ambience and atmosphere this thick, it's very clear why. There's a bunch of new enemies to fight here, including tall, graceful knights that, if anything, are more difficult to deal with than the larger skeletons from Carthus. The player does get a somewhat terrifying introduction to this area though, because as you cross the first bridge, you might be a bit too transfixed by the pale, lunar majesty of the city before you to notice the unspeakable toothy horror rushing you from behind. Just 2 hits, huh? Cool. As undeniably gorgeous as this level certainly is, I have always thought that it looks better than it actually feels to navigate. Not that I'm suggesting it's a weaker area or anything, heavens no, but I don't quite love it. I think a reason for this is because of the semi-invisible enemies roaming all around the place. Cool concept for an enemy and everything, and I believe the idea is that these are people who have had their flesh partially nibbled away by tiny insects of the deep, to the extent that their forms are now only semi-corporeal, but just putting me in a dark room with 20 of these things isn't quite my idea of thrilling combat. Also, the dog enemies absolutely suck here. The area boss, on the other hand, can be a real skill test. Pontiff Sylvan is for sure one of the harder fights in the game, and was also the second of the 3 bosses that I found absurdly difficult on my level 1 playthrough. Seriously must have taken me about 5 goddamn hours or something, but thankfully I beat him first time round here thanks to the power of pyromancy. It's at the next area along where things get gradually more and more nostalgic though. First we catch sight of the familiar armour of the Silver Knights of Anor Londo, firing arrows upon us from their great bows from rafters. They just can't help themselves, can they? And then further ahead, we literally do enter the actual Anor Londo area from the first game. See, of all the critiques of Dark Souls 3 that I've heard, not that there's that many critiques to be honest, I think the most common one I've heard pertains to Dark Souls 3's constant references to the first Dark Souls. Honestly, there are references everywhere here, to the point where the game can come across as trying too hard to pay homage to the original. I want to be clear though that all these references never really bothered me anywhere near as much as they bothered some others. If Dark Souls 3 was a game which overtly relied on its past and didn't do enough to establish its own identity in terms of both gameplay and a compelling world, then I'd agree that the many references would detract from the overall experience. However, I would argue that Dark Souls 3 consistently does more than enough to set itself apart in the trilogy and stand on its own feet. I do understand where the criticisms are coming from on this one, because the return to Anor Londo is borderline comical with how big a self-reference it is, but at the same time, I love Anor Londo, and if anything it's a pleasure to return here, an absolute pleasure, although the place has seen better days. There are even references within references here when we see that the corpse of the giant blacksmith from Dark Souls 1 is still here, somehow, but at least we can take and repurpose his giant's coal. Probably a decent time to talk about smithing in this game. See, Dark Souls 3 has just one smith and one smith only, and that's our man Andre, which simplifies things somewhat for us. Any weapon or shield can be reinforced to plus 10, increasing its stats and scaling, although there's also the Twinkling Titanite upgrade path or Titanite scale upgrade paths, which both just go to plus 5, applicable on special or boss weapons. Bit of a weird quirk I did notice in Dark Souls 3 though is that your Pyromancy Flame is also upgraded with Titanite, which just doesn't really make any sense. In the first game you reinforce it with raw souls, and in the second game this is done with fire seeds, but in this game you upgrade it with the same upgrade material used on everything else. Immersion Ruined, 1.5 out of 10. Reinforcing a weapon is great and all, and it'll always make it at least partially better to some extent. However, a more interesting and subjective way of modifying your gear is to infuse them with special gems found throughout the world, imbuing your weapons with various special effects. Just having a weapon and a corresponding gem isn't quite enough though, and you first need to find the corresponding coal and bring it to Andre. I used a fire hand axe for a while, and then when I got my hands on the Farron coal, I infused a barbed sword with a crystal gem so that it would scale with intelligence. Then later on, after I obtained the giant's coal, I could access the infusion I was really after: chaos. See, in this game, pyromancy scales with both intelligence and faith, and so the chaos infusion will make your weapon do the same, converting that scaling into fire damage. Dark Souls 3 is really great for build variety, and it's great fun to try out different infusions for different situations. Furthermore, the game lets you completely respec all your levels if you want to completely switch builds halfway through a playthrough, or for New Game Plus. I actually did this myself at one point, at the very end, and I switched to a pure dex build for a particular couple of tricky bosses. Within Anor Londo Castle, and in the same arena where Ornstein and Smo once terrorised many a player, awaits the grotesque Aldrich, Devourer of Gods. Aldrich was said to be a monk who devoured so many men that his body became increasingly prodigious and bloated, eventually turning into an amorphous black sludge. Here though, his form is strikingly similar to that of the Dark Sun Gwyndolin, implying that Aldrich has literally devoured Gwyndolin, now using his likeness and power. Aldrich is a tough boss, employing sweeping, wide-reaching cleaves of his spectral glaive and an assortment of ranged magic. But again, my pyromancy really came through for me here, and Aldrich went down in about a minute. At this point there's just one more accessible path available to us, and that is through Irithyll Dungeon and into the Profaned capital, where Yorm the Giant resides. Irithyll Dungeon is pretty notorious for having an enemy which can literally drain your max HP down to almost nothing just by looking at you, making for some very tense and dangerous scenarios. This place is filled with jump scares and shambling half-dead halls looking to push, swipe and grab. Like many levels in Dark Souls 3, the dungeon is miserable and grim, a gloomy menagerie of freaks and monstrosities. Really great area though, and densely packed with secrets and gates to return to after obtaining keys, similar to the Tower of Latria from Demon Souls. We're just passing through Irithyll Dungeon however, because our true destination is the Profaned capital, home of Yorm. I think there's something odd about the way the Profaned capital is laid out, because it took me about 3 or 4 playthroughs before I realised I'd only been exploring roughly half this entire level. There's a subtle wee path which can be accessed by jumping off a small ledge, which then leads to a bunch more optional stuff and a whole new enemy type which resembles a hippo with a head for a hand. With a hand for a head, fuck. There's also a toxic swamp here, of all things. Poison swamps are out, toxic swamps are in. Or you can just head straight for Yorm and try to dodge the fireballs hurtling towards you from far below whilst battling the monstrous stone gargoyle enemies. Seriously, these guys are awesome, and are of course what the gargoyles and Blackblade Kindred from Elden Ring are heavily based on. The fight with Yorm is another gimmick type fight, encouraging the use of a weapon literally taken straight out of Demon Souls called the Storm Ruler. Although if you really want to, you can fight him conventionally, it will just take much longer. This boss fight is incredible, and while it's not too difficult, it's very intense as you try to squeeze in a full charge for the Storm Ruler whilst Yorm is running directly towards you with his giant flaming machete. And with that, there is just one last Lord of Cinder whose remains are yet to be returned to Firelink Shrine, Prince Lothric. From here, the player returns back to the high wall of Lothric from near the start of the game, but now we stand a much better chance of defeating the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. Don't get me wrong though, this is still a really difficult fight, and regardless of the size of your health bar, she can easily reduce it down to near nothing with 1 or 2 attacks from her twin swords. A feature that Dark Souls 3 introduced, which Elden Ring went on to develop further, is weapon arts. Only here, skills are tied to their particular weapons, instead of allowing the player to mix and match Ashes of War with different weapons. Some of the weapon arts featured here are very functional, while others might be borderline useless. They do add a cool extra aspect to weapons, but I've never felt that weapon arts were a particularly vital element of combat in Dark Souls 3. Rather, they were mainly fun flourishes I'd occasionally pull out, rather than skills that I heavily relied on. Shields also kinda have weapon arts, but in many cases it'll literally just be a shield bash or a parry. And speaking of parrying, I could not nail it down in this game for love nor money. I used it a whole bunch in my recent Dark Souls playthrough, but was absolutely useless at it here. I tried it again and again at the high wall of Lothric near the start of the game before just giving up. I'm sure I would have gotten used to the timing eventually, but the idea of parrying is to take a risk for a big damage payoff, whereas there was no payoff for me because I was just dying over and over again, about 6 bloody times in the space of 2 minutes. The upper section of Lothric becomes accessible after defeating the Dancer, and it is hands down one of the best areas in the game, with the coolest enemies, and sections of this level are basically straight homages to Boletaria from Demon Souls. Although there are plenty of Lothric Knights found at the lower part of the high wall of Lothric, the ones found here are way harder, have way more HP, and seem to have more complex and aggressive movesets from what I could tell after dying 4 times in rapid succession to literally the first one I encountered. Haha. Upper Lothric is really damn hard in general though, and I died more times here than in any other area of the game. The placement of enemies is just so bloody fiendish, and their attacks are relentless, especially the dudes with the exploding crossbow bolts. Absolute pains in the arses. Also, I nearly lost my damn mind at the Outrider Knight here. I couldn't stop fucking dying to him and I got so pissed off. His movements are designed solely to confuse you and throw off your timings for dodges. Still, it can't be denied, awesome enemy. After climbing higher still, I am always floored by the sight of the bizarre pilgrim butterflies flying higher and higher into the sky, while the dying black sun hangs in the dead red sky. Things are so intensely apocalyptic at this stage in the game, and I've always found Upper Lothric to be an incredibly powerful level for that reason. It really tries to hammer home the desperation and perhaps folly of the continuous linking of the fire, because is all this ruin really worth preserving and extending? We get a close encounter with a larger pilgrim butterfly, as well as an electric blast from the past when we take on the Dragon Slayer armour which it's controlling. This is without a doubt one of the best bosses in the game. The design of the armour is incredible, obviously resembling Ornstein, except a far larger, cruder and more brutal version. I pride myself on being pretty damn solid at this fight, and it feels great when you pin down its moveset, dodging its terrifying attacks from its enormous curved axe and its crude, twisted iron shield. God damn it, I love this boss, and the track that plays while you're fighting it is hype! You do also need to watch out for the red explosions flying down from the pilgrim butterflies though, and on that note, I was actually the victim of a double KO for this fight, although thankfully I still got the win. Not too far off from Prince Lothric now, however, we must battle our way through the Grand Archives, an area which is essentially one massive reference to the Duke's Archives from Dark Souls 1. In saying that though, I don't want to detract from the quality of this level, because although it's not one of my favourites, it is very interesting, challenging and complex. In fact, I think it might be a bit too complex for its own good, because no matter how many bloody times I play through it, I always get lost at some point and not know where the hell I'm going, despite the number of shortcuts here. An element which does make this place acutely frustrating is the obnoxious fact that there's a crystal sage constantly raining down sorcery at you from various points in the Grand Archives, and when you get close enough for attack, after a few hits it'll just teleport away again, meaning that you have to fight your way through more enemies to get to it, while still getting pummeled, ravaged and shattered by every crystal sorcery in the book, or scroll if you will. After the treacherous, arduous ascent up the archives and up the long, well-guarded stairs to the highest point in Lothric Castle, we eventually reach the Chamber of the Twin Princes, Lothric and Lorien, and yet again, Dark Souls 3 serves us another outstanding boss fight. Everything about this fight is just perfect, and the idea to have Lorien constantly teleport around the arena, even mid-attack, is genius. The second phase is just as fantastic, requiring the player to deplete Lothric's health bar to stop him endlessly reviving his brother. Perfect boss with the perfect level of difficulty. The cutscenes that play at the start and the middle continue on the theme of somehow making me feel sad to play this game, while also having loads of fun. And now that all the Lords of Cinder have been defeated, their remains can be placed one by one on their thrones at Firelink Shrine for them to burn away and serve as kindling, even the still living Ludleth of Corland. I always found it messed up how he just goes up in flames while sitting there. Pretty sad. From here we can warp to an alternative version of Firelink Shrine which is in near total darkness. Firelink is such a confusing place in this series, because there are literally 3 different versions of it in this game, as well as the remains of the original Firelink Shrine from the first game, which we can visit again in the Ringed City DLC. The Dreg Heap is the site where the final boss of the game is fought, being the site of convergence where the world's cities, towns and villages have drifted, with castles and spires jutting out at every angle, crumbling now to ruin. With it being the last boss of the game and the series, at least as far as the base game goes, it'd be a real shame if they cocked up the final boss, but I'm pleased to say that Soul of Cinder is up there as one of the greats, not only from this game, but all of Soulsborne. I really can't praise Dark Souls 3's bosses highly enough, and I don't think there's a single weak boss in the whole game. Some are definitely better than others, but they're all great, while some are incredible. One reason for this, among many, is that none of them are too hard. Dark Souls 3 is a hard game, and I died a hell of a lot, but for the most part, I think the difficulty level is just right. Dragon Slayer armour is a damn challenging fight, with fast, ferocious combos, but it's not too hard. The Twin Princes can be very tough, and it can take a good few attempts before you start to understand Lorien's teleporting and can reliably dodge his long-range sword slam, but again, it's not crazy tough. I think this level of difficulty makes for overall more enjoyable bosses, because I'm not really a big fan of the whole formula of having to die 20 times against every new boss before you eventually learn its attacks and manage to beat it. There's a weird masochism thing with a lot of Souls players that seems to revolve around the intense enjoyment of repeatedly dying, but I don't get it. I like a challenge, but I also like to have fun. Then again, I am going to partially contradict what I just said, because Soul of Cinder was the final boss that I found absolutely brutal on a level 1 playthrough, and I literally died over 100 times on it. Now that's not an exaggeration, by the way. I literally died over 100 times before finally beating him, but I didn't enjoy dying. I'm just not very good at games. As has been the trend for the whole of Dark Souls 3, the second phase of Soul of Cinder is a direct homage to the first game in the series. The boss's stance and moveset take on the style of Gwyn, first Lord of Cinder, and Gwyn's theme is even incorporated into the soundtrack, making for a challenging, emotional and memorable final encounter. After taking Soul of Cinder down, there are 4 potential endings to go for, depending on whether or not you fulfilled certain requirements and questlines beforehand, but I went for the end of Fire ending, and I must say, it hit me surprisingly hard.
The first flame quickly fades. Darkness will shortly settle. But one day, Tiny flames will dance across the darkness. Like embers linked by Lord's Pass. Ashen One, hearest thou my voice still?
I haven't seen this one in years, but it's very cold, sad, and quite beautiful. Of course, we're not done yet, because there's a very noteworthy optional area to discuss, as well as the Ashes of Ariandel and the Ring City DLCs, both of which are very much worth discussing. Archdragon Peak is an easy area to miss, requiring you to use a specific gesture at this specific spot in Irithyll dungeon. Holding the pose for a few seconds will trigger a cutscene, causing your character to lose consciousness and then find themselves on a huge, ancient, anthropomorphic, snake-infested mountain peak. Not exactly sure how we end up here, but it's all good. This is a massive area filled with new enemy types, high-level upgrade materials, more references to the previous games, and two great bosses. The first boss is fought near the start, being another gimmick boss, but again, it's sick. You've got to frantically navigate your way up and through the ruins, dodging fireballs and battling creatures, whilst an ancient wyvern tries to fry you, only to die in a single hit from a plunge attack. I don't know about you, but this animation, as well as the over 8,000 damage it does in one blow, always puts a smile on my face. For being totally optional, this is a huge, beautiful level that looks really unique compared to everywhere else in the game. Just like with the Great Hollow, Ash Lake and the Painted World from Dark Souls 1, I've got a lot of respect for putting really big, high quality but easily missable areas in the game. Also, Havel is back, again, for some reason, and beating him gets you his ridiculous weapon and enormous shield, although as usual, my pyromancy came in very handy for this fight. The Ancient Wyvern isn't the only boss on Archdragon Peak though, because probably the most notorious and challenging boss in the base game can be found here, after ringing the massive bell that the game specifically tells you to not ring for some reason. The Nameless King is a huge challenge, not least of all because he's got two phases. Although the first phase can seem like a nightmare at first, it's one of those where once you get it down, you can clear it quite quickly, much like with Genichiro from the first phase of Sekiro's final boss. The second phase is just pure concentrated Dark Souls 3 though, and super challenging. I remember being stuck on this dude for hours on my very first playthrough years ago, summoning white phantoms for help, like a coward. Beating him does reward you with Onstein's Dragon Slayer Spear though, from Dark Souls 1, that's pretty cool. And so that leaves us with the DLCs, with Ashes of Ariandel being released 6 months after we got the base game, and then the Ring City coming out 6 months after that. So how about we get a goddamn move on, eh, Elden Ring? As discussed, Ashes of Ariandel can be accessed as soon as you get to the Cathedral of the Deep, whereas you can access the Ring City either after beating the final boss of Ashes of Ariandel, or after beating Soul Cinder. As you'd expect, the DLCs feature the most challenging content in the game and introduce some of the toughest bosses in the series. In fact, one of these bosses in particular actually borders on being too damn hard for my liking. Whereas most of Dark Souls 3 is set in a decaying, stagnant world with death and horror waiting around every corner, the first DLC, Ashes of Ariandel, is set in a decaying, stagnant world with death and horror waiting around every corner, except there's snow. Ariandel is a home for the forlorn, and the inhabitants of it can only be described as wretched. Diseased, bird-like creatures shamble and drag themselves around, clawing at you as you pass, and the larger forlorn belch toxic clouds of foul gas in your direction. Terrifying clawed corvians prowl the village, slaughtering everything in their path, and lost scores of followers throw spears and breathe fire at you on sight, while enormous insects revel and feast on red, rotting stacks of corpses in the pits below. Although this is supposed to be a home for the forlorn, it's just as horrific as every place else in Dark Souls 3. Of course, this painted world is also a reference to the painted world of Ariamis from Dark Souls 1, although lore-wise I'm not too sure what the connection is. Upon the release of Ashes of Ariandel, I remember a lot of people complaining about the length of this DLC, saying it was decent content but was too short. As far as the length goes, I wouldn't say it felt all that short to me. Rather, the length felt about right in my opinion, and the quality definitely felt right. There are only 2 bosses here, and one of them is actually optional, but even so, there's a lot to explore, and the level design found here is some of the best in the game. Also, I'm a damn sucker for a good frozen lake area, although I'm not quite so big a fan of getting crunched by trios of large crabs. The most difficult human enemy in the game is also found in this DLC, with Wilhelm being a huge pain to beat, although he is voiced by that dude with the absurdly gravelly voice that's in every game these days.
Every fleeing man must be caught. Every secret must be unearthed. Such is the conceit of the self-proclaimed seeker of truth.
The real highlight with this DLC, however, is Sister Frieda, who is in my opinion the most difficult boss in all of Dark Souls 3, and very reminiscent of Lady Maria from Bloodborne, only harder. Frieda is super quick, has delayed attacks and combos, can literally turn invisible, can frostbite you, and has 3 fucking phases. Intensely challenging boss fight, but undeniably awesome, especially when Father Ariandel, who's Scottish for some reason, joins into the fight in Phase 2, screaming and bathing the arena in fire. Phase 3 though is where the boss just gets silly, and as colourful and extravagant and anime as it all is, it's just a bit too damn much for me. It's so difficult, she does so much damage, and a minute can pass without you being able to get too much damage in because she won't stop throwing out combos of frost, dark and fire. The one saving grace which keeps Sister Frieda from being a true nightmare is that she can be quite easily staggered and backstabbed, and you can also summon Gale for the fight. Gale is of course the character we met back at the Cathedral of the Deep, but he is also the servant of a young girl who resides in the attic of the chapel within Ariandel. Although we don't really interact with Gale in Ariandel, he is arguably the most significant character in the Ringed City DLC. This DLC starts off in the Dread Heap, the same general location where we fought the Soul of Cinder. God damn it, this area is so cool, and again, it looks like the end of the world, which is what this DLC is all about. I absolutely love the Pilgrim Merchant at the start here too. Stellar voice acting, although she does kind of sound like an old cat. But I love cats.
Is it? I thought that clamouring tin can was the last. But here we go again.
The Dread Heap contains one of the most dangerous and frightening enemies in the series, featuring grotesque butterfly creatures who will barrage you with beams of holy light as you run around the area. Also, if you stay still and try to hide in one spot for too long, they'll bathe your spot in heavenly particles, building up curse. The way to kill these is to find the corresponding angel pilgrim, which will permanently take out the angel in that area. It's a nightmare trying to explore yet another poison swamp while being relentlessly attacked by these things, but that just makes it feel all the more rewarding when you do take it out and can explore freely. One slightly odd choice by FromSoft for the Ringed City is to include +3 versions of several different rings. See, in New Game Plus and New Game Plus 2, you can find the +1 and +2 versions of things like the Wolf Ring, the Chloranthe Ring, etc. But throughout the Ringed City DLC, they added in +3 versions of these rings, even on regular New Game, completely removing the incentive to hunt down the +1 and +2 versions of the rings on New Game Plus. Not a major design issue or anything, but a bit of a weird decision. The first boss in this DLC, the Demon in Pain and Demon from Below, is incredible, and with multiple phases of course. You can also summon Gale for this fight too. Each demon has their own unique movesets, and depending on which one you kill first, the moveset of the Demon Prince in Phase 2 will actually be a bit different, which is always very cool to see. Furthermore, there's something very special about this boss arena, because we happen to be in Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls 1, and from here we are transported from the Dread Heap to the Ringed City. While at first glance from above, the ringed city looks expansive, mighty and majestic, the further we explore this damned location, the more we discover how utterly desolate it is. Abyss-infested monsters stalk the streets, an anguished giant aimlessly roams through a black swamp, and scores of locusts try to tempt us with tales of the dark and a coming feast. The ringed city is dead, and quite literally sinking into the mud, and as superb as this DLC is, it's always kind of a bummer to play through areas like this because of how fucked everything is here. There's an extremely cool encounter though if you travel to the far end of the swamp, because the Dragon Slayer armour is here again and reanimates upon our approach, engaging the player in a final battle before disappearing forever. You actually get its armour here too, which is freaking awesome. With this being the final DLC of Dark Souls 3 and the final piece of Dark Souls content, of course there's a dragon too, and possibly the most ferocious and aggressive dragon in FromSoft history. It's an optional fight, but after knocking it down off a ledge near the stone bridge, we can take it on for real by later dropping down into its true lair for the ultimate dragon boss, Dark Eater Midir. This was actually the one boss in Dark Souls 3 that I could not beat, and the first time I played through the Ringed City, I had to give up on him because I just couldn't do it. I did end up returning a couple of months later though and eventually got him, and nowadays I can handle the boss without too much trouble. In fact, I somehow managed to beat Midir on my first try here, though my arse was clenched the entire time because I couldn't believe it was happening. The trick is to always attack his head, because if you do this enough, Midir will stagger and allow you to deliver a massively damaging critical attack, whereas if you just attack the legs, this won't happen. At the terminus of the Ringed City, we come across a girl called Filianore, who is heavily theorised to be the daughter of Lord Gwyn. She's asleep and leaning on a broken, blackened shell, and interacting with her leads to one of the most brutal cutscenes I've ever seen. This is Dark Souls 3 at peak levels of making me feel sad and empty for playing it. Just the way the shell breaks, and then the girl is transformed into a corpse who looks to have been dead for ages. Who knows what any of this even means, because this cutscene is so difficult to explain, but some sort of time skip seems to have taken place, or some illusion broken, transporting us to some future age where the world is truly dead, even more so than before, with the land now being made up only of ruins and dust. What follows is the true, final ever Dark Souls boss, and in my opinion, it might be the best boss in the series, Slave Knight Gale, now corrupted and monstrous. The boss arena here is absolutely enormous, and the game freely lets you make use of this whole space if you want to, and I think that aspect really adds to how epic and dramatic this final confrontation feels. Gale is very fast and aggressive and challenging, with relentless combos and maddened animalistic movements and manoeuvres. At around 60% HP though, that's when the true final battle begins.
the blood. The blood of the dark soul.
Best fight ever. And what's more is that Gale is at the perfect level of difficulty. He's very tough, but completely fair and achievable and fun. After defeating him, the final thing to do is to take the blood of the Dark Soul dropped by Gale back to his lady in Ariandel Chapel. And that, folks, as they say, is that. That is Dark Souls 3. It is a magnificent game and made for a perfect send-off to the Dark Souls trilogy, bringing its own fast, thrilling formula to the series, whilst also paying frequent tribute and reference to the incredible games which came before it. As always, I had a lot of fun playing through this game again, and a lot of fun making this video, and if there's anyone who enjoyed watching it, that's sick. I think I've just about said it all now, and so with that I will say cheers for watching and cheerio.